Hello, everyone, and welcome. My name is Shanila Kojamulji, and I'm a faculty member at the Al Walid bin Talal Center for Muslim Christian Understanding here at Georgetown University. It is my pleasure to introduce our guest, Professor Tazeen Ali, who will speak about her new book, The Women's Mosque of America, Authority and Community in U.S. Islam. Professor Ali is an assistant professor of religion and politics at Washington University in St. Louis. Her research focuses on Islam and gender in America, women and religion, and Muslims in entertainment, media, and popular culture. She teaches courses on religion and race in the US and Islam in America, which makes her a perfect speaker for ACMCU's course on American Muslims. And I see many of my students have logged in here as well. So Dr. Ali will speak for about 40 minutes, and then we can have a chance to engage her in a conversation. Thank you for joining us.
Great. Thank you so much. Good afternoon, everyone. I want to start by saying thank you to Professor Shanila Kojamulji for organizing this talk, and to Andrew Condon for handling the logistics, and for Shireen Durrani also for helping with the logistics. And thank you all for being here. This book is based on how American Muslim women reimagine religious authority and community through these dynamic approaches to interpreting sacred scripture, with a view towards building multiracial community that's rooted in social justice and empowering themselves as women. So today I want to share a little bit of background on the Women's Mosque of America and just situate it within broader mosque culture in the United States before delving into some of the particulars of the book. And then we'll have some time for a more informal back and forth. So the Women's Mosque of America is a multiracial congregation for Muslim women and their interfaith allies in Los Angeles, where women perform the call to prayer, they deliver the khutbahs, the sermons, and their leading ritual prayer at monthly Jummah, or Friday prayer services. And so the services are exclusively for women, although boys under age 12 are also allowed. And it was founded in 2015 by Hasna Maznavi, an American Muslim comedy writer who's in her 30s, or who's in her 30s at the time, and she's pictured here at in the photo on the right. In terms of the congregation, the size has fluctuated over the years. It started between 70 to 100 women every month in 2015, with attendance then dipping down to about a dozen or so each month during the peak of the pandemic, during which the Women's Mosque shifted its services to a virtual format over Zoom. They've now resumed in-person prayers, but even before the pandemic, they've had a sustained online presence with live streaming their sermons and posting them to YouTube. And so they've always intended to reach an audience much broader than the women who are physically congregating in Southern California. Amid these fluctuations in congregant numbers, there's been a core constituency of African American Muslim women over the age of 60 who other congregants would often describe as the heart of the community. And so there are also white Christian and Jewish women in the same age range who come as interfaith allies. And so there's also an ethnically diverse group of younger women in their 20s and 30s, Black, South Asian, white, Arab, East Asian, Latina, who are also in regular attendance. And so this racial and ethnic diversity is pretty consistent with the majority of US mosques. A 2020 study on mosques in the US confirms that they're actually among the most ethnically diverse religious bodies in the country, especially during Friday prayers. But usually that diversity is not evenly distributed, and 75% of US mosques have one dominant ethnic group. And so one thing that's distinct here about this particular community of Women's Mosque is that there is no single ethnic group that's dominating the congregation. So the Women's Mosque, it's not a purpose-built mosque. It's actually a nonprofit that's renting out space once a month for these Friday prayers. And so for its first couple of years, until from 2015 to the end of 2017, they hosted Friday prayer at the Pico Union Project, which was actually a synagogue turned multi faith facility near downtown Los Angeles, bordering East Hollywood and Koreatown, which are neighborhoods that mostly house Korean, Latinx, and South Asian immigrants. And so this bottom right photo here is the outside of the Pico Union Project, and the top is the inside. The photos from the previous slide were also from that original location at the Pico Union Project. They ended up moving venues in 2017 because of the rising costs of rent, since it does run on volunteer donations. And so they were temporarily housed in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints before finally moving to the First Unitarian Church, which is also in Koreatown. So that's where the Friday prayers continue to be held today. So when we think about the mosque spatially, there is a kind of interfaith element that's built into their ethos, which we can talk more about in the Q&A if folks are interested in that. So women-led spaces like the Women's Mosque have been cropping up all over the US and Europe over the course of the last 7 years. And they're a response to the broader mosque culture of the US. Their emergence speaks to a history of exclusion of women in mosques in the US through things like inadequate prayer spaces, scarcity in leadership roles, and limited access to religious education. And so, as far as general trends on American mosques, according to that same 2020 report that I cited before on American mosques, there are about 2,800 mosques in the US, and as you might expect, there's a lot of variation in terms of their treatment of women, of racial minorities, queer Muslims, new converts, so on. And some mosques are better than others in how equitable they are to these different demographics. But overall trends show that mosques across the US um, can be unwelcoming spaces for a lot of women. And so these charts here show that between the years 2000 and 2020, women have consistently only made up between 15 and 19% of Friday prayer attendance in comparison to men who have been between 75 and 80% of the congregation. The chart on the bottom indicates change over the course of the last decade in terms of how many mosques became more women friendly. And that was based on factors like whether they had women's programming, what the physical space for women's prayer looked like, if they had women serving on their executive board. So factors like that. Um, but US mosques vary a lot with respect to what they physically look like, with the size of the congregation, the internal layout, and the social norms, depending on the norms of the community. So when I talk about patterns of women's marginalization, they're not uniform and they're not universal across sort of nationwide trends. But broadly speaking, the worship spaces of men and women within these conventional mosque settings can be considered both separate and unequal. And so women's corridors are typically smaller, inferior. The 2011 survey on mosques did show that African American led mosques and Shi'i mosques typically are more inclusive of women than their Sunni counterparts with South Asian or Arab majorities. But these images here on this slide are of women's spaces in mosques all over the country, and they give us a sense of what women's corridors look like. And so in the first one, and these are taken from a Tumblr blog called Side Entrance, which is a project that started in that is ongoing since 2012. That documents discrepancies between male and female spaces. But this first photo highlights, this baby girl looking through the glass of the women's quarters, which is upstairs, overlooking a spacious area reserved for men. And it kind of, we can sort of see the emotional impact of gender marginalization because women can internalize from a very young age their exclusion from main prayer spaces as this toddler is looking in on a congregation that doesn't include her. And then we see some other images here of women praying behind a physical partition, or in a basement. And in a lot of these cases, women aren't able to hear the sermon or the khutbah. And so the folks at the women's mosque in the women's mosque community are implicitly critiquing these various factors that contribute to women's subordinate status to US mosques. And so while it's the first female only mosques in in the United States, it's not the first of its kind, and spaces that are exclusively for women have existed worldwide throughout history, including in China, in Syria, India, Germany, Yemen. And this is something that the mosque's founder and the preachers as well are very keen to highlight, because it provides this sense of continuity and legitimacy within the Islamic tradition. And so conversations about the issue of women in mosques, or access for women in mosques, have been taking place publicly for quite a while, at least publicly since the early 2000s. And Muslims who are committed to cultivating more equitable spaces for women and for converts, for example, have been working on these issues in their local communities. So, in this regard, projects like the Women's Mosque of America have been years and years in the making by Muslims who have been consistently arguing for change and for more equitable spaces, and articulating their ideas about what constitutes authentic Islamic practice, by going back to the sources of the tradition, namely the Quran. And so the founder, Masnavi, she envisaged the women's mosque as the space where Muslim women can become empowered by acquiring Islamic knowledge and confidence to then go back and enact changes in their co ed conventional mosques. So that's the broad picture of how the Women's Mosque comes to be and what the community is responding to. I just want to take a moment to talk through also what they're up against in trying to create these more gender equitable spaces for themselves and trying to enact change in mainstream US mosques. Which brings me to some of the central questions that underpin the book as a whole. And so there has been a sustained interest in Muslim women in the US and Western imagination for centuries when we think about the European colonial legacy in the Muslim majority world. But in our national context specifically, we've seen very explicitly that there are serious anxieties over the idea of whether or not Muslims belong in the United States. And these anxieties have played out in different ways, but often Muslim women serve as these passive sites of contestation over whether or not Islam is compatible with modern liberal society. So basically, any project that's spearheaded by Muslim women, no matter how careful the actors themselves are in how they articulate their projects, they're always at risk of being co opted by a pervasive neoliberal narrative that Islam systematically oppresses women and denies them power and authority. So, on the one hand, these Muslim women actors have to think about how to avoid complicity with Western imperial frameworks while also simultaneously arguing against patriarchal trends and misogyny in the Islamic tradition that they're trying to contest. So, there is this added pressure on them because American Muslim women are acutely aware of how their moves might be interpreted by different people, and they're also the ones who are bearing the brunt of Islamophobic discrimination, because they tend to be more visibly Muslim through the way they might dress, for example. So, one of the broad questions that the book addresses is how do American Muslim women negotiate their marginal status within their patriarchal religious communities while also confronting US, the very real Islamophobia that already questions their national belonging and renders their communities vulnerable to violence. And then also, since they're sidelined and marginalized from roles of authority in the vast majority of mosques across the United States, what are the alternative models of authority that they're advocating for? And how do they collectively reimagine what a mosque is and what it should be? So, I approach these questions through a mixed methodology of textual analysis and ethnographic fieldwork. So I analyze a selection of sermons, which I'll talk about a couple today, from different female khatibas, from female preachers. And I also conducted 23 ethnographic interviews with different members of the community in Los Angeles in 2017. So these are broadly the five topics that the book explores, like that correspond to the five chapters in the book. I'm going to focus on the middle three, highlighted in blue here. But if folks have questions about the others, I'm happy to talk more in the Q&A about that. So briefly, by ritual authority, I mean women having the right to lead congregational prayer. And so in some ways, by being an all women's space, the organizers of the Women's Mosque were kind of trying to sidestep any potential controversies over the idea of women leading men in prayer, which is not considered an acceptable practice by many Muslims around the world. So, despite the fact that it's an all women's congregation, there still was a significant degree of controversy associated with the women's mosque within mainstream Muslim communities, even in the very local Los Angeles, Southern California context, over the technicalities over whether women-led Jummah, Friday prayer, should or could be considered legally valid under under the Islamic jurisprudential tradition. So, but from the perspective of the women in the actual community, they did not seem particularly fixated with ritual authority in the sense that it felt implicit in the space that, they were, by nature of the fact that women were leading prayer and praying there, but they didn't really see themselves as doing anything necessarily controversial or trying to prove a point. And here I highlight a quote from one of my interlocutors that shows what she appreciated about the Women's Mosque. And so she says, "I love new things. I love things that turn things we know on their side, not on its head, but on its side a little. It's what I love best about the Women's Mosque. It's when you take something you know really well and put it on its side. So you get to experience it in a new way. I've heard a gazillion adhans, heard a gazillion khutbas, but the fact that it's just being done by a woman instead of a man, you get to encounter it from a fresh perspective." So this congregant loved that it was just a fresh take in her mosquing experience. And so we can infer here that this congregant is a regular mosque goer in her sort of regular conventional co-ed mosque setting. And to her, this is just something that's tilting things to the side a bit. And similarly, other women that I spoke to were not that interested in the question of women's ritual authority unless I brought it up myself. And this is despite what critics and even supporters from the outside had projected onto the space as this sort of radical development where women are fighting for the right to lead prayer. But when we think about Islamic authority, this mosque really helps us think about how it's about more than prayer leadership. And the community members' lack of concern for ritual authority sort of points to the other kinds of Islamic authority that they are invested in, like interpretive authority. So, Muslim women's interpretive authority is the authority to read and interpret the Quran. And so, traditional scholarly authority is based on the acquisition of formal, specialized knowledge through studying the Quran, Hadith, traditions of the Prophet Muhammad in Arabic, the classical Islamic legal tradition with the teacher or a sheikh. Um, and throughout Muslim societies prior to the 20th century, women were largely precluded from acquiring this kind of formalized scholarly authority because only men had access to formal education. And there are, of course, exceptions to that, particularly if you were a woman in sort of a religious scholarly elite family. But for the most part, only men had that access to formal education. And so men exclusively exercised the right to interpret scripture, both the Quran and prophetic tradition, in an authoritative way. And so one thing that's happening at the Women's Mosque of America is that there's this contestation of existing models of interpretive authority that privilege men's voices and erase women by emphasizing that you actually don't need to be a scholar to be able to interpret the Quran in an authoritative way. And they emphasize this by inviting lay Muslim women who are not scholars to give sermons. So the first preacher, Adina Likovic, who was then the director of the Muslim Public Affairs Council, she delivered the inaugural sermon in 2015. She's Bosnian American, not a native Arabic speaker, which is something that she emphasized or she mentions in her sermon. And she also emphasizes the centrality of using the English vernacular in American Muslim communities. So Likovic, in her sermon, recites Surah Fatiha, which is the opening chapter of the Quran, in English, and then she asks the congregation to recite it back to her in English. And the value of doing that in English is for her is the accessibility and the unmediated connection to God that it provides. And so the accessibility of the text in turn facilitates the process of applying particular verses into the daily lives of believers. So, by emphasizing the importance of engaging the Quran in a language that she understands, she's challenging the Arab centricity and patriarchal dominance that typically characterizes Islamic authority and knowledge. And so, in her promotion of the Quran in English, there is this implicit critique of American Muslim tendencies to venerate Arab male scholars and their patriarchal interpretations that often marginalize women. So she argues that adhering to traditional male interpretive authority interferes with cultivating a personal relationship with God. And for her, English translations of the Quran provide that unmediated connection. So she's also endeavoring to shift traditional understandings of religious authority. And so by highlighting her lack of traditional religious credentials, Likovic's self-described status as a non-scholar acts rhetorically to expand the parameters of Islamic authority to include lay Muslims and, in particular, Muslim women. And so I'm just going to play a short clip here where she emphasizes her status as an everyday lay Muslim. Is the sound working?
I don't hear it.
Okay.
Andrew, can you help?
Yeah, it's not working for me either.
I
I
think
just chiming in
Andrew.
real quick. Are you
Okay.
not able to hear the content?
No.
Oh, I can definitely hear it. Let me try a screen share again. One moment.
Hmm.
Yeah, it doesn't sound like the audience can hear either. Thank you.
Try this again.
As the first khatiba of the
Good.
Women's Mosque.
Thank you.
I thank you and the sisters and brothers who are involved in the board for entrusting me with this privilege and for recognizing that someone other than a scholar can give a khutbah, which happens in other mosques all the time. I take great pride in reading the Fatiha here in English because when we understand the text, when God speaks to us directly, we get the jolt that we are looking for. We get the jolt to our hearts, to our spirits, to our souls, if we look for it. And inshallah, we pray that this experience of a woman's Jummah will jolt your spiritual senses and that it will create opportunities for your spiritual upliftment. Just preparing for.
going to stop it here. Thank you, Andrew. And thank you, everyone, for bearing with me. So in this clip, she's stating that she's not a scholar, and she's thanking the Women's Mosque organizers for allowing her to give a khutbah as a non-scholar. And so when she asserts that non-scholars serve as male preachers as khatibs in U.S. mosques all the time, which is met with a little chuckle from the congregation, she's claiming continuity with the Islamic tradition and again emphasizing that the women's mosque is not doing anything new, but just expanding these practices to include women. At the same time, however, I'm arguing in the book that the Women's Mosque is doing something new. They're not just creating these parallel spaces to conventional mosques where women are taking up men's roles and giving sermons. The sermons are actually branded as very distinct from those at other mosques. And they're grounded in the assumption that women have something distinct to offer in their readings of scripture. And this difference is written into the leadership's vision for the mosque. So in 2017, Masnavi wrote a 16-page document with requirements for delivering a sermon. And it provides us insight into their developing ideology on the criteria for authority. And it actually instructs preachers to foreground their personal experiences. So it states, please keep in mind that one of the things that makes our mosque unique is the ability to hear from firsthand female experience. We encourage you to make your khutbah as personal as possible. Your vulnerability helps the congregation connect with you. And so rather than attempt to emulate this male disengaged style of sermons at mainstream mosques in their own sort of description of how sermons are in mainstream mosques, the leadership at the Women's Mosque is cultivating a form of authority that's based on emotion and experience. And the leaders are actively instructing khatibas to share their vulnerability and weave in a personal narrative in their readings of the Quran. And so I want to show an example of how preachers do this, and so how they've used experiences in their engagements with scripture. And so this preacher, this Khatiba Sumaya Abu Bakr, she gave a khutbah on sexual violence in which she spoke to the congregation as a survivor of repeated sexual assault. First as a child by a family friend, and again in adulthood at a mosque by an imam. And so in her khutbah, she argues for a Quranic imperative to stand up against sexual violence and remove the stigma around victims. And her khutbah demonstrates how alternative models for gaining religious authority can be obtained through experience rather than through religious education or formal training. And so here I'm drawing on Patricia Hill Collins' Black feminist epistemology, in which lived experiences and empathy are valid forms of assessing truth claims. And so underpinning her sermon is the Quranic concept of rahma, or compassion. And she contrasts how even though rahma is among the most mentioned concepts in the Quran, Muslim communities lack compassion when they promote a culture of silencing around victims of sexual violence. I'm going to play a 1-minute clip here.
What I learned from my experience was that compassion and justice are inextricably linked. Without compassion, there is no justice. And without justice, there is no compassion. I learned that a compassionate and just response is the most transformative response we can make when facing adversity. And the concept of justice is so central within our tradition, within our deen, that we were commanded in Surah An-Nisa, verse 134, "O you who believe, stand up firmly for justice as witnesses to God, even if it be against yourselves, your parents, your relatives, and whether the case of a rich person or a poor person." And so what this means is that a compassionate and just response means that we decide for ourselves that there is no topic that is too taboo for us to address, that our discomfort is not a reasonable excuse to shirk from the responsibility of protecting one another.
I'm going to stop it here. So Her sermon encourages Muslim communities to collectively address sexual abuse. And this is a particular interpretive strategy. She's drawing on broader themes of the Quran that exist across the text as a whole, and she's applying them to particular circumstances. And so, by foregrounding particular themes of the Quran, she's attenuating her voice as a subjective interpreter and giving the appearance that the text is speaking for itself, which is consistent here in the image of her physically standing behind the musaf, behind the text. It's also relevant that Abu Bakr co founded an organization that facilitates sexual violence support for American Muslim communities. So she's also claiming authority through her professional experiences of working with survivors of sexual abuse, but not as a scholar of the Quran. And so grounding authority in an individual's reading of the text empowers the preachers of the women's mosque to speak with the authority that would otherwise be denied to them as lay Muslim women. So this was not the only sermon at the Women's Mosque that addressed gender violence. And I want to linger on this point for a minute because for khatibas to raise these kind of issues of gender violence within Muslim communities is tricky because these women have to carefully navigate the patriarchal gazes of both the American Muslim and non Muslim publics. And so they're occupying this very precarious position in which their critiques of trends within Muslim communities are, again, like susceptible to being co opted by Islamophobic narratives because they're calling attention to issues within Muslim communities. And yet they're not shying away from these sensitive issues and topics, which shows how the Women's Mosque is a site for the production of contemporary gender egalitarian exegesis that accounts for the experiences of women of color. I want to make sure that we have enough time, so I'm not going to play a clip from this sermon, but just to kind of give us a sense that they often address sensitive issues internally within the community. I want to turn to the congregation itself and to kind of give a sense of how they are receiving these khutbahs. And so this is a quote from one of my ethnographic interviews that shows us how congregants are receptive to the sermons at the mosque, and they are drawn and persuaded by how these female preachers exercise their authority. So this is a quote from one of my South Asian interlocutors who was in her mid-30s at the time, and she's speaking generally about what she appreciated about sermons at the Women's Mosque. So here she's saying, I noticed that men versus women are always yelling from the pulpit. Everything is just yelled at as if they don't have a microphone. The sermons are very judgy, like you guys need to be doing this, this, and this, and drawing verses from the Hadith and Quran about that. Versus what I hear at the Women's Mosque that reference the Quran in a much more nurturing way. It's all about the nurturing sense and not the fiery pulpit sense. And so here we see that Seher has a critique of male styles of preaching at mosques, and she's sort of mocking male forms of authority when she's saying that men are always yelling, whereas there's a different kind of credibility to her from the women's mosque sermons because they feel more nurturing, they're speaking in their normal voices. And this is then what she was used to in other mosques. And so here she's commenting both on the content and delivery as far as the kinds of topics these sermons are addressing. And then also the approach that these female khatibas take towards the Quran. And what's interesting here is that the differences that congregants like Seher notice are by design, right? So if we think back to this slide where khatibas are given specific guidelines to differentiate their khutbahs from those at other mosques, this is actually what congregants are observing and pointing to. So I finally want to touch on the interracial dynamics at the Women's Mosque. I mentioned earlier in the background, in the beginning of the talk, that it was a very racially diverse congregation. So it is a very useful place to think about or to examine how they grapple with anti-Blackness in US Muslim and non-Muslim culture. So, scholars like Jamila Karim and Sherman Jackson argue that immigrant Muslims, including first, second, third generations, primarily South Asian and Arab, are actively complicit in anti-Black racism, despite their shared historical consciousness through the brutal experiences of subjugation through American slavery and European colonization. Immigrant Muslims tend not to identify with Black Muslims, according to these two scholars, and they have a mutually conflicting relationship with American whiteness. So the Women's Mosque of America is attempting to challenge existing Muslim congregational patterns in the US by offering a new model of community that's multiracial and inclusive. And so I argue, however, that there are real challenges to cultivating the shared sense of American Muslim identity across racial lines, and racial boundaries are at times actually reinforced at the Women's Mosque in their institutional attempts to engage anti-Black racism. So in 2016, the mosque hosted a three-part discussion series on Black Lives Matter after Jummah, after Friday prayer. And so the first two sessions were co-facilitated by two Black Muslim women, Camila Wilkerson, a past Women's Mosque preacher, and Disha Deshawn, a member of Black Lives Matter. And Maznabi, who's South Asian, facilitated the last session. And so the discussion series intended to focus on how members of the Women's Mosque could productively engage the movement as allies. And reactions among my interlocutors as to the effectiveness of these discussions was very mixed. So it was mostly non-Black congregants who felt satisfied with the series, and they felt really proud that the Women's Mosque was devoting attention to the BLM movement in the first place, and paying attention to issues of racial injustice that they identified as typically being ignored in mainstream US mosques. And so others, particularly younger African American interlocutors who are under the age of 40, as well as some more politically active South Asian congregants, felt underwhelmed by the sessions, and they felt the discussions were not very deep, and not deep as they could have been. And then some of my older African American interlocutors in their 60s felt very strongly that the discussion series was very well intentioned, but that many of their fellow congregants simply lacked the requisite knowledge of African American history that would be required to understand the Black Lives Matter movement, let alone learn how to become an ally. So Zahara, who was an African American congregant in her 60s, shared the following. And this is a quote from her, where she says, "The truth of the matter is that so many people who were there truly did not have a background in the history of African Americans in this country. So it's not even a matter of them not caring. They don't even know what the problem is." And so here she's expressing the need for increased knowledge among congregants, and she was somebody who was very deeply invested in the Women's Mosque, in the success of the Women's Mosque, and she felt very strongly that its leaders were working actively towards trying to create an inclusive space. And so we can take her remarks as a reflection of the challenges of reaching meaningful interracial understanding, even among well-meaning community members who are making some kind of effort. So the racial discrepancies in my interlocutors' reflections on the Black Lives Matter series indicates how creating multiracial community is challenging, even in spaces where folks are trying to consciously cultivate a more racially inclusive space and a shared American Muslim identity across race. But even if we were to consider that discussion series as a failed attempt, as many of the congregants did, if we take a step back from what they attempted to achieve by hosting that series in the first place, we can think about it as a broader redirection of what a mosque is supposed to be. So in this type of programming, they're making the case that the mosque should be a space where people not only come to pray, but come to become educated on issues of anti-Black racism. And this is something that they've continued to work towards in the last several years. So, for example, they've since had sermons that focus on figures like Betty Shabazz, the wife of Malcolm X, where they're bringing to the fore narratives of prominent Black figures to sort of to elevate and to secure their place in history as a way to bolster the status of Black women in the Islamic tradition, which many congregants often don't know anything about. And so these kinds of topics in their sermons, there's another one. I have a slide here on Juneteenth. And so addressing these sort of topics in their sermons are a part of how the Women's Mosque is is addressing anti-Black racism on the level of discourse through education. And I just want to linger here for a minute to highlight that the dissatisfaction from the 2016 series is one of the factors that then leads to there being khutbahs on specific topics that highlight Black experiences or Black historical figures. And so, as I mentioned earlier, the khatibas are often community members themselves. They're mostly lay Muslim women without traditional credentials. Not all of them, some of them do have traditional credentials. But in fact, congregants are encouraged to sign up and volunteer to give a khutbah. So those who are unhappy with the discussion series had this outlet to then educate and encourage others to give these sermons on topics that they felt were lacking from communal knowledge. And so there is this kind of triangular flow of power between board leaders, preachers, and congregants in this lay model of authority. So to conclude, I focused on three particular aspects of my book on American Muslim women's authority and the Women's Mosque of America. So first, I argued that the Women's Mosque opens up space for Muslim women, particularly non-native Arabic speakers, to lead prayer and to take up positions of authority by emphasizing English language translations of the Quran and inviting everyday women to serve as preachers. Secondly, I argued that the mosque, both as an institution and as a community, privilege the embodied experiences of women over religious knowledge as a criteria for interpretive authority. And I lastly addressed how the mosque addresses anti-Black racism and the extent to which congregants believe those attempts are successful, and how they respond to these attempts as a part of an ongoing dialogue about what a mosque should be. And so overall, the Women's Mosque is drawing attention to new ways that Muslim women are constructing religious authority by renegotiating normative assumptions around women's roles in their communities. And so by extension, these women are legitimizing specific ways of being American Muslims. And I'll end here. Thank you all for your attention.
Thank you so much, Professor Ali, for this wonderful presentation and for this important contribution to our understanding of Muslim women in America. I already see some questions, and so I will try to see if we can make Jordan a panelist so she can ask her questions herself and engage with you. And then after Jordan, I see Catherine also has a question.
Thank you so much, first of all, for coming in and just doing this with us. It's been a pleasure. It's been very interesting. So thank you. And I just wanted to ask, I think my first question was specifically in the Women's Mosque or in mosques in general, but it seems more specific to the Women's Mosque. How does one go about conducting an interfaith sermon? Like, how do you make sure that everybody is accommodated, everybody's concerns are addressed, everybody's faith is addressed, things like that?
That's a great question. Thank you, Jordan. So they don't conduct interfaith sermons in the sense that it's not an interfaith practice. It's just opening up the community to welcome women of other faiths or of no faiths to come join in this space. But the prayer, the ritual prayer, they're all they're conducting like Muslim ritual prayer. It's Friday prayer. But it's an interesting question because that inclusivity is in the forefront of organizers' mind in the sense of they require all of their preachers to translate everything into English and to conduct all of the anytime they're required to cite from the Quran and when they do, they're required to, if they're going to say it in Arabic, because there are folks who who have Arabic expertise, who are Hafidha, who have memorized the Quran, who can recite very beautifully in Arabic, and they're always required to translate in English, which is making it accessible for the interfaith congregation members, but it's also making it accessible for folks in the community who might not have that kind of same extensive knowledge of the Quran, or extensive knowledge of Arabic words and things like that. But it does sort of, it's interesting to hear you pose a question about how to accommodate other faith traditions, because I think that's also one of the critiques of the spaces, and in terms of why is it open to these other faiths, if it's, if, especially when we're thinking about safe spaces that are exclusively for women, what does it mean to not have a space that's exclusively for Muslims, and constantly sort of thinking about how to accommodate people from other faith traditions. So that's a great question.
So my other question was, how do you, on kind of on that same tract of thinking about inclusivity, how do you include LGBTQ plus community members in specifically the women's mosque, but also like more broadly in mosques in general?
That's a really great question. And I think one of the things that I was saying in when I mentioned ritual authority, and how a lot of folks are saying, well, oh, so it's interesting because a lot of folks within the community, but then also critics of the community, argue that this is not a radical space, right? They're not doing enough, and they have not. So I'm not really sure. I'm not in terms of what has happened recently, but as far as they're not going to. Sort of explicitly say that somebody, if you're a self-identifying woman, so a trans woman who identifies as a woman, that I don't think there would be an issue with that person attending Jummah services. But to date, I have not seen an openly queer Muslim or a trans Muslim woman give a sermon there. And it's interesting to think about the women's mosque in the larger context of other inclusive mosque initiatives. So the Tawheed Jummah Circle mission initiative from that I think it started in 2012, or maybe even or 2005 in Toronto, openly queer mosque. Then there's Masjid Rabia in Chicago, which is a queer-led, woman-led initiative. And so, oh, sorry, Masjid, yeah, and there's also one in Berkeley, and there's other spaces that are much more sort of explicit in being inclusive towards LGBTQ Muslims. But what's interesting too is they don't necessarily court, so the Tawhid Jummah circles, they don't court the same kind of media presence and media attention the way that we can sort of track what's been happening with the Women's Mosque of America since 2015, precisely because there are probably people in those communities who want to protect their identities if, for example, if they haven't come out to their families and things like that. Whereas the Women's Mosque of America definitely courted a very heavy media sort of relationship from the very beginning. And so they're public in ways, these other spaces that have existed for longer and have been doing this kind of work, arguably more radically, are maybe not as well known.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jordan. We'll move on to Stella.
Hi, I just want to thank you for the talk. It was really interesting. My question was, do you ever see and kind of witness firsthand how these spaces can transform into spaces of refuge, and especially in times of crisis or where the community becomes super important?
Thank you, Stella. That's a great question. I think certainly I remember one of my interviewees mentioning her frustration, and she was a regular mosque goer in her community mosques. And she recalled this incident of going to her mosque on the Friday after the presidential election in 2016. Which was a very sort of shocking moment for a lot of folks in the U.S. and for Muslim communities in particular. And she remembers having this sort of cognitive dissonance of going to that mosque and the preacher never acknowledging what had just happened in the country a couple of days before. And her not really feeling like there was a space to collectively process or mourn this national event. And so they often would talk about the women's mosque as this space where they can like think about and process, especially political events that have been going on that year. And so in Southern California in 2017, that was sort of at the peak of all of the sort of anti-immigration rhetoric, all the ICE raids and deportations. And so it's a space where a lot of women would turn to and find solace in the fact that those national issues were being addressed by religious leadership. So I think absolutely, I think it can be a place of, it has served as a place of refuge for women during particular crisis moments.
Thank you.
Thank you, Stella. We'll move to, I'm sorry, I don't know how to pronounce that name. Allman.
Very interesting, this whole, your presentation. I did buy your book. I haven't read it yet. I am an artist, and I was also at one point a research scholar at Georgetown. I'm curious, I was very interested in, at the beginning of your presentation, the various photos of women's spaces, okay? I'm more familiar with although I'm an American convert to Islam, all of my work professionally has been done in Turkey, particularly in Istanbul, okay? Working with scholars, working with the Diyanet there. I am curious, based on your experiences looking at American mosques and women's spaces, do you see any, anything that is architecturally, visually, or calligraphy that would relate to women in Quran, particular ayats, important women of Quran? Is there anything on this level that you've observed in the United States?
I think that's such a great question. I also don't feel sort of poised to answer it in terms of not having that much background in thinking about architectural elements of this. But I think certainly it would be an interesting question to explore. I think in mosques across the US, some of them sort of just take on architecturally as we see mosques around the world, right? Take on the elements of whatever host country they're in. And so there's these great images of mosques in sort of the southwest of the US that in that sort of limestone setting. And so that's something that I think I've noticed to be true. And then a lot of, in that minority context, right, mosques can be storefronts, they can be a room and a space, they can just sort of be rented out. So here in the space that I'm writing about, it's actually inside of a church. And so that's also sort of pointing to the transience of the space, which is why I don't feel poised to necessarily be able to answer this question accurately, because it is taking place in a church, and doesn't necessarily sort of the image, especially if you're coming from the Turkish context, the image of a mosque that comes to mind is not what this space would spatially look like. But it's a great question.
Thank you. We have a last question, and I know there are a couple of minutes if you wanted to take the question from a student of mine, Taryn, who's trying to figure out how to respond to folks who might emphasize the unequal sort of status of women within Islam, particularly in relation to the verse 434. I know this is a little outside of what you talked about, but if you wanted to venture a response.
Yeah, thank you, Taryn. I think what's really interesting to me whenever this comes up is just how much real estate verse 434 occupies in the American Muslim imagination, disproportionately to maybe other themes in the Quran. And I think it's because all of these questions are, and not to discount it or to not to sort of to trivialize its importance or its how some Muslims find it very problematic in its in the way that it sets up a particular gender hierarchy. But I think it's also relevant to think about how the context, the pervasive context of Islamophobia, informs the way that Muslims themselves think about their tradition. And so what's interesting is when I was doing fieldwork in 2017, this verse was never addressed by any of the katibas. And the sermon that I didn't end up playing the clip on, the Najiba Sayed tacitly refers to it, where she's talking about domestic abuse, because in this verse, in certain interpretations of this verse, it allows, or it grants permission for men to physically discipline their disobedient wives. And so she does address that verse, to say that, and to call for sort of a new model, but of marriage and of family, but she doesn't come out and explicitly sort of analyze that particular Quranic verse. And so, one of the ways, I think, if I'm understanding the question correctly, I think that there have been many Muslims who have been troubled by that verse precisely because it sets up a particular gender hierarchy. And so, what those scholars will say, and there's so many resources on this, like scholars like Amina Wadud, Aisha Hidayatullah, Asma Barlas, and who all have a different kind of or point to different approaches of how this has been addressed. And then there was, in 2020, a women's mosque sermon that specifically focuses on just this verse, which is actually quite interesting. And she has a couple of different interpretations where she discounts the idea that this could possibly be setting up a gender hierarchy. But again, I think what's interesting is that texts don't speak for themselves. And one of the the underlying themes of the book is that these women are asserting their right to read and interpret texts for themselves. And so the idea that texts aren't self-evident, they need to be read and need to be interpretive, and they're adding their voices to the mix. So I think that if you're interested, that would be something to look into in terms of thinking about how Islamic feminist scholars have reread that verse, how modernist scholars have reread that verse, how classical scholars look at that verse. And so the sort of the canonical like text, or at least in the book of all of these authors that are used. So Aisha Chowdhury's book on domestic violence in the Islamic tradition, she talks about how classical jurists address this particular verse. And so I think there are a lot of resources on there that set up how this has been interpreted over time and how contemporary Muslims with sort of gender egalitarian sensibilities grapple with this.
That's awesome. Thank you so much. Thank you, Professor Ali, for being with us, for sharing your knowledge with us. Thank you to all the participants, to Andrew and to Shireen for managing the back end of this. We're very grateful and we look forward to seeing you again soon. Thank you, everyone.